Welcome to Annette on Life, Liberty, and Happiness, a podcast where I talk about the Constitution, history, politics, and pretty much anything else I want to talk about. And you can find this podcast on AnnetteTalks.com, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, and finally, iHeartRadio, which I've been trying to get it on there forever. So I'm excited that it's there. You can also find the episodes on YouTube, youtube.com/Annette Talks, and you can see what we look like. And I am kind of excited and also kind of horrified at our topic today. We'll be talking about 1984. And as you can see, I brought in a guest. This is Jennifer Maughan. Hi, Jennifer. Jennifer is a good friend and just an intelligent lady. And she agreed to reread the book along with me and talk about it with me. So thank you for coming, Jennifer.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and we've both been exchanging texts about how nightmarish this book is, and in reading it I realized that I'm pretty sure I never did read this before. I remember like lots of references to it. People are always talking about how Orwellian things are, and they say that's really 1984, and so I assumed that I had read it, but started to read it and I'm like, this is not familiar at all. And for those of you that haven't read it or it's been a long time, it's basically a dystopian novel about the main character, who is Winston Smith, and he is a member of the party, which is basically like the Soviet Union party, the Communist Party. The book is based basically on Nazi Germany and Soviet Union era communism and Nazism. And so this character, Winston Smith, is in the outer party. So he's not in the inner party, he's in the outer party, but he's a member of the party in this, in London, but it's not England anymore. It's part of Oceania, which is one of three big areas that are now making up the globe, basically. It's kind of like when we had the Soviet Union, or the East and the West, and we had two poles that were running the country or running the world. But in this, it was like after World War II, and there were these three superpowers. So it was Oceania, which was basically the West, including England, Great Britain, and I think parts of Australia, maybe. Anyway, and then you had Eastania, and then you had, was it Eurasia?
I think so, Eurasia,
something like that. Anyway, it's three basic superpowers that were controlling the earth, with Oceania including England, and this gentleman is in England, and he's a part of the party, but not the inner party. And he's trying to live his life in 1984, where basically it's run by the party, and they have a character called Big Brother, who looks a lot like Lenin. And in the house, in all the homes and in the workplaces, there's a screen that looks like a TV that is a two-way TV screen, I guess you could say, where it's watching you, surveilling you, and putting out information. And so they're constantly monitored all the time by thought police. And they were listened to, so they could be heard and seen, and subjected to constant propaganda. And so it's basically a communist country run by the party with Big Brother. And it was controlled, the people were controlled by the threat of being basically seen by Big Brother or the party, or tattled on by neighbors or kids. I thought that was really striking. Children were raised to tattle on their parents. And so you couldn't even trust your own children. And it was just a very tightly controlled society where the people were kept hungry at basically just above starvation level. There was never enough to eat. There was never enough to go around for food or clothing or anything. And so they're just kept just above starvation level, but fed constant propaganda that things were always constantly getting better, all the time getting better. And the other big element is that they were always at war with either how come I can't say it now? East Asia, Eurasia, the two other superpowers. They're always at war with one of those two other superpowers. And so they're always being told, oh, we're about to win the war. We're so close to winning this war. And in the book makes it clear that even if two of the superpowers had ganged up on the other one, they couldn't have won. Nobody was ever going to win. No one was ever going to take control of another superpower. So it was a constant stalemate. But that was how they kept Oceania in control, was kept them at starvation level or just above starvation level, and always on the brink of winning the war. And there were occasional bombs that would drop, and it seemed like that was actually their own country that was doing that, but it was made to look like it was one of these other two superpowers that was dropping these bombs. So what am I missing here, Jennifer?
I think you've covered it pretty well. I mean, I think for me, just so much of it was just the tone, the what it was like to be. I guess I'm thinking citizen, but it's more like being a subject in Oceania at that time, and it's so fortunately still foreign to me in terms of like I don't want to live like that, and that doesn't seem like my world.
Right. But when you get into the book, it feels like you're in it, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, the writing was so powerful. You feel like you are trapped in your little tiny nasty apartment with a screen watching you the entire time, which really is not completely far from what could happen. And we'll get into that. I mean, the whole point of talking about 1984 is where are we in terms of being in 1984 society. And what was interesting is that they had the party, they had the outer party and the inner party, and they were the ones that had, they were the ones that were monitored all the time. And they were only like 15 to 20% of the population. And the rest were what they called the proles, or the proletariat, right, which they considered to be animals, or, you know, way lower class citizens. And I remember several times thinking in the book that if I lived in that time, I'd want to be a prole, because they were not monitored. I mean, they weren't, right, they weren't terribly intellectually curious, and they weren't politically astute at all, but they weren't monitored 24/7, and they just kind of went about their lives. And I think that part is kind of an echo of England, especially at the time, because it's always been a very class structured society. And whereas we haven't been that way in America. But but it was really striking what they used to control the people. And one of those things was called doublespeak, which was where, and I have to find it really quick here, they had these ministries, the Ministry of Love, which was basically the Ministry of Hate. So the police, the military, all of that. And then they had the Ministry of Plenty, which was really all about rationing. So it was really the opposite. And then there was the last one, which was the Ministry of Truth, which was really the propaganda arm. And so everything was the opposite of what it actually was. And so doublespeak was the way that you would say something and then say its opposite, and then doublethink was how you somehow held those two in your brain and believed them both, like you were supposed to believe them both. And so like the three things that the Big Brother, the big slogans, I guess, that Big Brother will use is war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And somehow, and those were like on the side of one of the big, I think it was the Ministry of Truth, on the side of the building. And of course, Big Brother's picture was everywhere. And so everywhere you went, you were forced to look at Big Brother, and you heard these slogans. But war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And that reminds me of how, you know, I think it's in Isaiah where we were taught that in the last days that good would be seen as bad and bad would be seen as good. And so basically it'd be like everything would be turned on its head. And I see that now.
Oh, I see it as well. And I think you have to look at it not from the standpoint of an individual or what truth really is, because they were defining truth. They were not even, it wasn't about truth. They were changing everything to fit their own narrative. And so it advanced what the party needed it to be. So that's one of the things that you realize later on in the book, when Winston is reading Goldstein's book.
All right, Goldstein is I'm guessing fictional character that they made up to be the leader of the resistance. It's never clear if there ever actually was a resistance, because Winston thought he was joining the resistance. He was betrayed. He was trapped in it by O'Brien, who was his co-worker, but a member of the inner party, who he thought he was going to go meet up with to join the resistance and read the book by Goldstein. But it turned out that O'Brien actually helped write the book that was supposed to be by Goldstein.
So yeah, but it makes, to the reader, it's incredibly illuminating, and I think that's, to me, I was thinking, so is this Orwell's message to us? To me, that's what I got out of it. I thought, oh, this book is what Orwell is telling us to guard ourselves against, that perhaps this is the thought behind the speech that we see in the propaganda, at least in the book. But it's not to say that there's no propaganda around us. Certainly there is.
Oh, right. No, there is plenty. And there's so many themes in this book. It's interesting, but one of the main themes, and this is Winston's job, was to basically change history, because whenever the party would make a prediction or a goal, say we're going to reach this goal, and then they wouldn't reach it, that couldn't be allowed to happen. Like, one of the funny things that happened in the book was that they were getting 30 grams of chocolate a day. That was their ration. But then the party decided to lower it to 25. And so what happened? There were announcements made that they were raising the ration from 20 to 25. And so it was like the past just didn't happen. They were never at 30. It was like everyone just collectively accepted, oh, we've been raised from 20 to 25, and completely forgot that they were at 30 and were lowered to 25. And that was really interesting. And so Winston's job was to actually go and find old stories. Like if there was a story, and he was supposed to be doing the Times, and he went back to the old Times. If there was an old Times article that says chocolate has been raised from 25 to 30, he needed to go back and erase that and change it so it would comport with what's going on today. And so his job was to literally go back and change history, or at least that's what was supposed to happen. They control, what was it saying? That if you control the past, you control the present. And if you control the present, you control the future, something like that.
Yeah,
and
there's
so
definite words.
They were controlling the past by going back and changing newspapers. They would go back and change books. Like, they would pull books off the shelf, rewrite them, and reprint them. And it was like, you see that happening today on Facebook, right? Like, oh, no, this isn't fact. That's got to come down. Like when those doctors did that press conference about hydrochloroquine or whatever that stuff's called, and they came out and they did this press conference. And I remember watching it. I saw it on Facebook. I was like, this is fascinating. I sat and I watched this 30-minute press conference from these doctors, and I was like, wow, this is really interesting. Later that day, it was pulled by Facebook. Completely pulled by YouTube. I don't think you can find it today if you want to. Just completely pulled. And so the difference is, of course, it's not the government doing it, but it's
Social
Facebook,
media,
which controls a huge part of our speech, right? So that's one way to promote, censorship. And so that's censorship. But then you also have, they were erasing history. So if there was an old article that didn't, like, he had to go back and take a person out because he had been disappeared. Because people would disappear and then their names would go off the rolls. It was like they never existed.
Right, you were an unperson.
Yes, they became an unperson. So they would have to go back, and if there was a story about them in the newspaper, they had to go back and cover it up with something else. So he actually made up a person from whole cloth, a hero. So he's basically, they needed someone to write fiction to change history.
Right.
And what that reminds me of today is how we have people actually calling to cancel history class. There's actually, I can't remember which state it is, but, and I can't remember which politician it was, but he wants to cancel history. And we have people pulling down statues and wanting to basically scrub history. And I was thinking about this the other day, and it's always, or right now it's in the name of racism. And that always seems to be, if someone owned slaves, we can't look at anything that they did in the past. And it's come to the point now where even Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, people that we revered growing up, we are now being told that they need to be canceled because they owned slaves. And so it just occurred to me like a few days ago, I don't know why it took me so long to figure it out. The reason that they are being canceled is not because they owned slaves. And I knew that wasn't true. It wasn't the slavery thing. It's because they were teaching and promoting and fighting for individual liberty. That Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration. George Washington founded our country. These are the people that founded our country on the whole concept of individual liberty. Well, the same people that are trying to cancel them in the name of erasing slavery or racism are the same people that are self-ascribed Marxists. And so they don't want individual liberty, they want collectivism. You can't promote collectivism if you're still celebrating people that were promoting individual liberties. I could see if something.
I think you're right in a sense, but I think also the ones who are pulling down the statues are not, I think, the ones who are making those connections. I think, how there's that 2 minutes.
Some of those are useful idiots. Some of those people.
Well, what they have is there's the inner party and the outer party. And most of the people in the party are in the outer party, and they're the ones that are doing the revisions, and they're rewriting history. They're the ones that are involved in these different ministries. They're the ones that are doing the work of the party. Mm-hmm. But the actual thought, the actual philosophy of the party is a lot better known within that inner party. And so I think it's a little bit like that in some of these organizations. I really don't think that a lot of the people that are out there doing, whether they're protesting, pulling down statues, rioting, whatever, I really don't think that they are in on the full philosophy of what's going on. I think they're doing the work.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. I agree with you. I think most people that are pulling down statues are doing it because they think it is a racism thing. Or a lot of the rioting and looting is just, hey, look, I'm angry. I want to riot and I want to loot. This is fun. Or, but there was a meme that I shared yesterday, and I heard the quote. I actually heard the lady saying it. She's one of those people I would consider inner party. And that's like the Black Lives Matter organization, the actual organization of these women that started this group, Black Lives Matter. These are inner party people. These are Marxist people. These are people that are working with other people that are inner party, like Antifa, that are there. They want Marxism. They want communism. That's their end game. Anyway, this one lady who was saying that looting was just another form of reparations. And because the store owners, what did she name? Macy's and Gucci, I think. And so, of course, we're supposed to think, oh, the rich, companies. It's okay to loot them because they have insurance. It'll pay for them. And this is she said this is just reparations. And this is going to allow those people to eat and buy clothing. And so that, obviously, if you think that looting is okay, then you don't honor the concept or believe in the concept of private property. And that's one of the main tenets of individual liberties, is we've got to be able to own our own property. Mm-hmm. And so you've got to do away with individual liberty and private property if you want collectivism or Marxism. And that's one of the biggest themes in 1984 is obviously nobody owned anything. Like everything was for the party, it was Victory. Like everything was put out by Victory cigarettes and Victory, and they couldn't get a hold of razor blades.
Right.
Everything was rationed. So nobody owned their own stuff. They could only get what the government would give them. And that's how they kept control over them.
Orwell does such a great job in the very, very opening page of describing, he's walking into his apartment and it talks about how, what is it? I think is it Victory Apartments or something? Victory Mansions. Right. Victory Mansions. And then the next line talks about how it smelled of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. There's a huge disconnect there, and that's that double think where you've got one name and it's completely different. But if you can accept it, then then it works, because you can promote your narrative, because you can get people to accept something because you gave it that name.
Yeah, well, that was the other really fascinating thing. At the end of the book, there's an appendix for Newspeak, which is a language that the parties developed. And the main goal of it was to keep narrowing and narrowing and narrowing the language, and taking out words, like they were taking out the word bad. I thought that, that was very telling. They were taking out the words religion and family, but because if you didn't have words to put to your thoughts, you couldn't even explain what you were thinking, and then it would get to the point where you couldn't even think about it because there were no words to describe what you were thinking. And so it was really interesting that they were narrowing and narrowing and narrowing that language and making it smaller. And I stopped and chatted with a friend not too long ago. I saw out on a walk, and he's a professor, and he was telling me how our vocabulary has gotten really smaller, much smaller, over the last, I don't know, maybe 100 years or so. And you look at now texting and social media, and you have a limited number of characters, and you can see it's kind of the dumbing down of the whole world, not just our country. And so it's happening it's not purposefully happening. It's just happening as a result of, I think, technology. We can do things, so quickly and instantly, and we want to reach out to people instantly. We don't want to sit down and write long letters, longhand to anyone anymore. Why would you do that when you could shoot out a 3-word text and say everything you need to say, right?
Isn't Winston criticized at some point for all the polysyllabic words he uses? But I just remember seeing that, and having a degree in a communications field, there's this fine line where you don't want to use fancier words than you need to, because sometimes those simple words are the best words to use, and you reach a larger audience, and it's fine. But you reach a point where if you are dumbing things down too much, you can't really get your ideas across. But there's a passage I just wanted to share where it talks about, as a result of the Newspeak, that there won't be any thought like we understand it now. Orthodoxy means there's no thinking. You don't need to think, because orthodoxy is unconsciousness. And that's not the world I want to live in.
Right. No, ignorance is strength. That's if that is hammered into you, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. If that's hammered into you, and you're going around with these double speak and double think, yeah, eventually you're going to believe that. And it got to the point where when O'Brien was torturing Winston, you've got to read this book if you haven't read it, people, because Winston is betrayed, and he's brought into the prison there, where of course they're monitored. Every room's got these monitors, but O'Brien takes him in and basically tortures him to the point where 2 + 2 can mean 5. If the party wants it to be 5, he kept holding up 4 fingers, like how many, like this, how many fingers, and tortured him to the point where he finds, I don't know what, because for the longest time his brain held on to that's 4, of course it's 4, right? But he tortured him to the point where he was actually questioning his own existence, because he asked him, does Big Brother exist, right? Because they see this big picture of this guy that looks like Lenin, and not John Lennon. For all those of you that don't know your Soviet history, you need to go back. Jennifer and I are lucky. We're at an age where we grew up during the Cold War. I always say that this actually, I'm going to be 52 in a few weeks, and I used to hate the fact that I was getting older, but now I think this is actually a really good age, because I can remember 1976, when it was the spirit of 76. So like, I was raised in a time when we were patriotic, and we learned the Constitution, and we understood individual liberties, and we lived through the Cold War, and we remembered that there was always that constant threat of the Soviet Union could attack, right? And they were the communists, and we were the capitalists, which is actually a Marxist term. But we knew the value of the free market individual liberties, and we knew that the Soviet Union was doing the opposite. And we lived to see the fall of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. and you know, the aftermath of that. And so we know this is a familiar theme to us.
Hmm.
But to people that are a decade or two or three younger than us, they don't have the advantage of being raised during that time. They don't understand that this dystopian novel is actually really based on Soviet Union and Nazism. And even when they kept switching enemies, right? Like 1 minute that's East Asia, the next minute it's Eurasia. And I know I'm saying those wrong. But even though they went from one enemy to the next, like mid-sentence, the minister of whatever, the politicians up there talking about during hate week, talking about who their enemy was, mid-sentence changed from one enemy to the other. And the people immediately turned around and pulled down all the posters and signs of the old enemy and put up the new one. But that was actually based on reality too. I was reading about this and how during World War II, the Germans and the Soviet Union were allies for a long time, and then at the end they were not. And so it was like this weird switch of, oh, I'm from one enemy to the other. But we can remember that. And so people that weren't, but people that are much younger, especially my socialist and communist friends that are in their 20s or 30s, they never lived through it. They didn't see what was going on. I guess they haven't watched White Nights either, or some of these other, you know, movies from the 80s where you could see what was going on. So people have got to read this and understand that this is a real threat. And so when we see people in our country right now, like BLM, Black Lives Matter, and Antifa, who are openly espousing collectivism and Marxism, you say, whoa, wait a minute. And you don't think it's terribly dangerous until you see people starting to do things like erasing history, canceling our founding fathers, you know, pulling down statues. And then you start thinking, oh, you know, this is not heading in a good direction.
It's always different when it's not in your neighborhood, when the proximity, until it's happened to you. It doesn't even have to be political. I know that for years and years, wildfires were something that happened in California. And then all of a sudden, my home was threatened by a wildfire here in Colorado and almost burned down. And from that point on, now that I've been in evacuation traffic, now that I've wondered if I'd ever see my house again, when I see wildfires, there's this sadness, there's this emotional connection, and it will always be real for me. But because I've experienced it,
right,
it's real.
Right.
But I totally understand how for others, it's just a phenomenon that you see on the news, and it's unfortunate, but they don't really get how real and how extensively damaging it is.
Right, and it's not just BLM and Antifa and those rioters and looters. Even bigger to me is the reaction to the virus that we're seeing and the lockdowns. That is not anything that we have ever seen in our lives. We have never lived, and we're in our early 50s, late 40s, and we've lived long enough that if this was, you know, a way America operated, we would have seen it by now. My mom didn't see the closest we've ever come is, you know, like World War II, you know, before our time, maybe, where they had to pull the curtains, the blackout curtains, and have air raids, you know, things like that, air raid sirens going off so that they would know to be safe. But never like this, where businesses were told that they had to close their doors, people had to stay inside, and First Amendment restrictions, churches shut down. I mean, we're still not back to church every week, and we're being highly restricted when we do go back. And masks, you know, and it's funny because so many people are, especially when this first started, just wear the damn mask. That was the meme, you know, going around, just wear the mask. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal to me is when you walk around and you see everyone wearing masks, and if you're not wearing one and you feel out of place, and people are actually getting angry at you. I had a friend tell me on Facebook that her husband was walking out in an empty parking lot outside of the school back to his car, and the superintendent of the school leaned out of the window or said something, and leaned out the front door or something, and said, and basically chastised him for not wearing a mask in an empty parking lot outside. And so the idea that we're all supposed to, first of all, mindlessly, because there's no logic behind that. There's no logic behind wearing a mask in your car alone. There's no logic in wearing a mask outside when you're nowhere near anybody. And to mindlessly do that, and also that if you go someplace and you're the only one wearing one, that's the collective out there. We're supposed to be doing it for the greater good, right? So it's antithetical to my individual right to say I don't want to wear a mask, especially if I've looked at all the studies, and it's, some studies say it does some good, and other studies say it doesn't do any good. So I should be able to say as an individual, well, you know what? I don't like wearing a mask. You haven't proven to me that these are very effective, so I'm not going to. But the climate that we're in right now is you'd better go along. That's a very collectivist.
It's an absolute compliance.
And yes, exactly. And mindless compliance. Do not use your brain. Ignorance is strength. That's what I think when I see that. Don't use your brain. Don't logic your way through this. Just mask up. Ignorance is strength. And so to me, that's what I kept thinking about. Like, oh my gosh, that's what's being promoted right now. Or the other silly restrictions, like our governor here, who's now made it 10 o'clock as last call for alcoholic bars, because though he's always got a new villain. Every time he goes out to do one of these press conferences, I can't watch them anymore because I get so angry with him. But the latest villain is these 20-somethings that are out there partying and having a good time and hanging out in groups, of course, because that's what they do. Well, no, this is the summer of no parties, is what he said. And because they're out in groups, if last call is at 10 o'clock, then maybe they won't gather around in parties anymore. So now last call is 10 o'clock.
Well, I'm not hearing a lot of science. I'm not hearing a lot of answers. I'm not hearing a lot of, we're discovering that this is a problem. We're discovering that it's transmitted in this way. Most of what I'm hearing is condemnation. Yep. And which is interesting to me, and that's one of the parallels that you see when Winston is in the ministry of love. He sure sees a lot of other people some people who he kind of thought might wind up there one of these days, wind up there, but there are also people he never ever expected to get turned in. But there's a lot of hate out there, and I think in the beginning, I think there was a lot of fear, and I think a certain amount in the very beginning of the pandemic, no one knew what we were dealing with, and everything was disappearing off the store shelves, and I don't think we knew, were we going back to work in 2 weeks, or what's going on? But I think things have changed. I think there's still a lot of fear, but we're getting to that point where there's a certain amount of hate, and it reminds me of how they have the 2 minutes of hate, where that's kind of their daily injection, just to remind you how you need to. And it's interesting to me that that's something that they are honest about. They don't call it by the wrong name. It purely is the 2 minutes of hate. It's how they get them to be that sort of like a religious fervor. It's their patriotism, I guess, that is their hate. But they get them so
hate as well.
And they get so riled up. I mean, it's just, it's frightening to see how they're talking about this ecstasy of, or a desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces. And I'm thinking, how do you get people to the point of wanting to be that way? Because that's not reality for me. I mean, I think I believe that there are people who are that way, but I think that's the thing I'm looking at is how a society gets to that point where they've stopped loving, they've stopped caring.
It's conditioning, and so when you say when you condition everyone that you should all be wearing a mask all the time, and if you're not wearing a mask, then you're selfish and uncaring, and you don't want to be inconvenienced. And so if you can condition everyone, it's awfully easy to go out and see, right? This is a highly visible thing. It's not like washing hands. You don't know whether this person's taking care of their immune system, but you see immediately whether they're wearing this mask or not. And so if you're conditioned, even subtly, even I find myself, and I am anti-mask for these reasons, these very reasons. Even I go out sometimes And immediately I'll start thinking, well, who's wearing a mask, who's not wearing a mask? And I'll start thinking, those people that are wearing masks look like idiots. And I'm like, I can't think that way because I'm conditioning myself. But I can see how easily it is for people to condition themselves, and they're being conditioned by the media and by our politicians. Our governor said that you were a bastard if you were out not wearing a mask. I mean, if that's not promoting hate, I don't know what is. That, you know, that raises, I'm glad that you mentioned fear and hate, because it seems like right now people have chosen fear, right? Because you can look around. I did the math on this. We've lost about 160,000 people in our country out of about 330 million. That's 0.005% of the population. And yes, every death is tragic, but I also, that number is inflated, because we know that probably the majority of them died with COVID and not from COVID. And so those who have actually died from COVID is going to be much smaller than that. And those are the people mostly who were over 80 and had some other comorbidities. So it's not that deadly of a virus. And it also seems to be getting less deadly as time goes by. But every time there are new cases, and there are going to be more new cases because it's going to keep spreading, but the media keeps whipping us up into a frenzy. Oh, so many more cases, more cases, more cases. And they never talk about hospitalizations or deaths. It's just more cases now because hospitalizations are going down and deaths are going down. But anyway, people seem to want to hold on to that fear. And even though you look around, and I don't know anyone that's died. I know one person that was hospitalized with it. But I've known several people who have had it and been fine. They've gotten over it after a little while. You know, some have had it worse than others. But it's not this giant, huge danger that we thought it was going to be in the beginning. I mean, here we are 5 months into it. It's not getting worse, getting better. And yet, if you talk to people and they act like it's still just as bad as they thought it was in the beginning. And so they seem to be clinging to that fear. I don't understand that. That like the schools right now, you know, like school, my girl's school is going to do 2 days at school, 3 days at home. And when they go to school, kid you not, parents are not allowed in the school buildings. That is not okay. I'm already on the warpath on that one. And in between, the kids are going to be sitting apart from each other, you know, in these cohorts, separate from each other. They have to wear masks the whole time they're in the school. In between each class, the teacher has to go through and spray down all the desks and everything with this stuff that dries quickly. I mean, it's just insane, the madness that they're doing this, even though the CDC and the American Pediatric Association has said it's safe for kids to go back to school like normal. But no, because of parents and teachers that are clinging to this fear, no. We're lucky that any of them are in school at all. I was sitting in on one of these little meetings yesterday, Zoom meetings, and one of the parents was sitting there as they were talking about how the kids are going to have to wear masks at all times unless they're outside and socially distanced from their friend. And the teacher, the parent was like, oh, good, keep those masks on the whole time. And I just wanted to reach into that screen and throttle her, because kids have been at home for 5 months not wearing masks around their friends, people. They don't catch it, and they don't get sick, and they don't spread it like we adults do. This is ridiculous, but they don't want to hear that. There's like, ignorance is strength. They don't want logic. They want fear. Sorry, I get very wound up about this.
Well, I read this really, really good essay by, I think it was Larry P. Arnn, and is he president of Hillsdale College?
Yeah.
And he talked about how it's important that people not be viewed as merely reservoirs for a pathogen. And
yes.
Honestly, I feel like all of a sudden public policy is being made not with the idea that we're human beings with psychological and emotional needs, with economic needs. Nobody's taking a look at the whole picture. I feel like it's just all about, well, you could have the virus. And I don't know that we're approaching this with any answers. There are some big solutions that are being proposed without a lot of reliable data. And it's pretty frightening to me that they're talking about distancing in a way that, for me being confined to my home, And having all these deadlines was really disturbing. I don't think I knew how much I got out of having a commute, having that buffer between what I do during the day and then coming home. I don't know that I realized how important the people that I saw on a daily basis were to me. And having those connections, those social connections are incredibly meaningful to me. And they are to children as well. And I don't think that we know the full impact of the loss of those connections until people have been harmed. And it's unfortunate. We certainly, I don't want hospitals to be overwhelmed. I don't want people's family members to die. I don't want to lose a child.
Right.
But I feel like we aren't focusing on answers or getting answers. I feel like we're pointing fingers and blaming. And I feel like the divisiveness that it's creating is really harmful to our society.
It is. Well, and the other thing is that people don't seem to realize how valuable or precious our freedoms are, and they're like, okay, yeah, no problem, I'll mask up, no problem, close me down, shut me down. I mean, people are literally asking their leaders to restrict their freedoms. People were mad that the governor did not enforce a mandate until he did, and then they were, oh, thank you, governor. I spend too much time watching his press conferences and seeing the comments, gosh. But people are literally like, oh yes, please take our freedoms away, please. I'll never understand that. I can see wanting to do your part and asking other people to do your part, but why you would want to be controlled, I don't understand. And so this is the 1984 thing. It's like, if you want to be controlled, you'll be controlled. Oh, yeah. And like our governor just renewed the emergency 30-day mask order, even though the numbers are better. It's not about flattening the curve anymore. It's like, we are going to be controlled until it's gone, and it's never going to be gone.
Well, there will always be another virus out there.
Yeah.
I mean, if I keep hearing arguments like, well, we just don't know enough about what's going on. I'm thinking, I don't know. There's a lot of viruses that we haven't even identified out there. Some of them are potentially pathogenic. Anybody with a lab and nefarious intent can manufacture, if you know enough and you have the right stuff, I'm sure you can manufacture a virus that has some pretty bad ways of harming people. And I think you can release it and spread it somehow. I'm sure there are ways you can do it. But I don't know that bringing us to our knees economically is the way to do it. And in the book, they talk about some of that, how the war is really a device. Winston talks about, because he can't remember anything, there's no reference point. You can't go back and look at a book or a newspaper because everything's been rewritten. There is only the present. There is one continuous narrative that is always in agreement, because all those people in the Ministry of Truth keep rewriting history to make it match the present narrative. So he talks about having a foggy memory, like, can't remember, has it always been like this? I don't think they invented airplanes. I remember there were helicopters before, what? Right. But yeah, he even says at one point, am I the only person with a memory? But yeah, I mean, it's dangerous. It's dangerous.
Well, and if people are so willing to just throw out their freedoms for a virus with a 0.005% fatality rate, what are they willing to do for a 0.5% fatality? Like the way that people are reacting, it feels like it's a 5% fatality rate. It feels like it. Like, that's kind of like when the first 2 weeks when this started happening, and we were all like, whoa, this is freaking me out. I expected to see ambulances in the street taking my neighbors away to the hospital. I expected to see people dying. I mean, it felt like that kind of thing because of what we were seeing coming out of Italy and New York. And now that it's not there, I just wonder, if it didn't take that much to bring us to our knees, like you said, what's next? It won't be, something else easily could be much worse than this. And so that's one of the reasons why you've got to read this. I don't think people understand the danger, but this is what really happened in the Soviet Union. This is what really happened in Nazi Germany. This is North Korea. and you can't really find out much about North Korea, but when you do hear about North Korea, it's very similar to this. The people are at starvation level. You know, electricity is turned off, and lights are turned off at a certain time. In 1984, his lights were always out at what, 10:30 at night? You didn't have the option to turn off and on your lights. He could not turn off the screen that was always watching them. And we're not to that point now. However, we're pretty close. I mean, the capability is there. Alexa, I've got Alexa down in my kitchen. You know, that she's listening all the time. It's not that difficult to hack into one of these that's got a camera, or to the laptop that I'm sitting in front of right now. It's not that difficult to imagine a society where we already have the cancel culture, where you're fired, you're ostracized if you don't say the right things. That's crime speak, right? Crime thought. If you don't have the right view of history, yeah. Even among some of my friends, it's like I'm ostracized for not wearing a mask, or I'm at least, you know, told that I'm selfish. And so if you don't go along with group thought,
right,
you're having crime thoughts and crime speaking. And so we're already heading in that direction in those ways, and erasing history, and doing away with the concept of private property. These are very real, very possible things. This is a possible situation that we could be in if we don't start saying, whoa, 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 hello, people. I don't want to wear a mask, and it's okay for me to not want to wear a mask. And so this is why we've got to start paying attention to what goes on and pushing back a lot of it. Because otherwise we do end up in 1984, not in a good 80s music way.
Right, definitely.
So I want to encourage people, if you haven't read this, or if you haven't read in a long time, read it. I also hear that, was it Brave New World you were telling me that was more?
There are several books there are some similarities. It's been a long time since I've read Brave New World. Anthem was one that I read more recently, but it was a very brief read. The similarities between those books and in 1984 is that at some point there's a love story, and it's an illicit love story, because this isn't how it's supposed to work. You're not supposed to really fall in love with someone. You're not supposed to be in charge of your relationship. And, you know, there's so much control in those societies that you're paired up with someone, and these people, by some means or other, have their own independent relationship that they have chosen, and it's wrong. And the stories are all different, but I think it gets into that whole realm of, at least in the society that I live in and value, that's something that's precious to me, you know, that you get to choose who you want to associate with. You get to choose who your friends are, who you're going to form a family with, and that you get to choose who you want to spend time with and who you care about, and that you get to have these feelings, and that it's okay to express
them. You get
them.
to make your own choices about what you do with your life, as
yes.
opposed to doing everything supposedly for the greater good. And so when you start seeing things like religion under attack, like we're seeing right now with our First Amendment severely curtailed, when you start seeing attacks on the family, which we're seeing also by being told that, you know, it takes a village. Okay, the family's not that important. Groups like BLM denigrate the family. So when you see religion and family and individual choice being denigrated, then you know that what the person wants is collectivism, which generally means communism, Marxism, and doing away with liberty. And if you happen to be a member of our church, you also know that right now we are reading about Captain Moroni and how he's standing up. To me, it's no coincidence that we are reading that at this time in our history. And I'm very grateful for the reminder of these several chapters in Alma where Captain Moroni and these other leaders are standing up for liberty and fighting for liberty, and rallying the troops to fight for liberty, because they know without liberty you have nothing. And so people, I want you to wake up, wake up, read 1984 if you haven't, think, spread the word about it, talk about it, other books, start talking about freedom, start pushing back on these mandates, start pushing back on us being shut down by the government, start pushing back on schools not opening. Anything that seems wrong to you, that smacks of government control over your individual liberty, you need to, at the very least, be questioning it. And at most, push back on it. Because otherwise it's going to come to a time where we're going to have to start practicing civil disobedience, because the Constitution is a higher law than the laws that are being passed that are unconstitutional by our governors and our county commissioners and state legislators and, you know, all the other legislatures. So anyway, thank you for joining me, Jennifer. One of the reasons why I was glad to have you is that when I start getting wound up, you are very calm and very logical, and you keep me grounded. And so I really appreciate you being willing to go down the road of reading this dystopian, hard to read book again, and sharing your thoughts with me and being willing to discuss it with me. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, everyone, please go read the book, share it, share this episode, go to youtube.com/Annette Talks, share it, or find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or AnnetteTalks.com. Tell us what you think, or tell me if you have any other ideas for an episode you'd like to hear about. In the future, I'm going to be doing an episode again on fear. This time on Feardom, I'm going to be talking to Connor Boyack, who's the author and libertarian, about how the government uses fear to control us. And I also have an awesome episode coming up with an expert on the Middle East about the peace deal between Israel and the UAE, which is very exciting. So thank you for listening to Annette on Life, Liberty, and Happiness.